Hi, Jorn.
Hello.
How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV, and you are Jorn de Kock, a Belgian journalist. You write for the Belgian newspaper, The Standaard. You're also the author of a book called Arabian Dawn, which is available in Dutch. And you are now, as I understand it, in Lebanon, but you've recently been in Syria?
Yes, I returned a bit over 2 weeks ago. So I was in Aleppo, which was my second time in Aleppo. I was there 4 or 5 months ago. And so, yeah, I could see the differences, 5 more months of war and of winter made. It was a big difference, actually. 5 months ago, I thought Aleppo was the scariest place I've ever been to. And now it was even scarier. So not a lot of good news there.
So it is increasingly besieged. I mean, did it seem in serious danger of actually falling to the rebels?
Excuse me, could you repeat that?
I said, did it seem as if Aleppo was actually in danger of falling to the rebels anytime soon?
Very difficult to say because 5 months ago when I was there, they were nowhere near the airport, which is a very strategic place in Aleppo. Obviously, that's the international airport plus the military airport just next door. Now, they were besieging the airport. So there seemed to be some advance on the terrain, but the problem was that the regime bombed even more than I've seen it 5 months ago. So there were planes constantly in the air, which is very scary if you have hours and hours of planes over your head and you don't know where they're going to strike. So whereas a couple of months ago you sort of, needed to go to the front lines, to the very front lines, to feel that acute sense of danger. Now it was everywhere. And so there are 1 million people living in Aleppo knowing that any second they can die. We've seen awful scenes of missile attacks on civilian neighborhoods where a whole neighborhood was flattened. People buried under their own concrete roofs. So it was even nastier than last time. So the more the rebels, the more the rebels advance, the more indiscriminate the attacks by the regime become.
So the government is having to bomb parts of Aleppo proper, parts of the city itself?
Yes, well, they were doing that before already, but now it's much more intensive. What the rebel fighters say about that is that, we are in that front line, so we know we can die. But our families are back there, and actually it's much more scarier to know what could happen to them than, what we know can happen to us. So it's sort of psychological warfare. Let's call it terror. It's what it is. They just want to punish the city, the liberated part of the city, for being in rebel hands. And they want to, the regime wants to make clear to the people that, okay, you're in rebel hands now, but that doesn't mean at all that you're going to be safe. So it's a very dirty war.
And are these parts of Aleppo, by and large, the parts that have been liberated, are they parts that are inhabited by Sunnis?
Well, since the large majority of Syrians are Sunnis, it's safe to say that the large majority of people over there are Sunnis.
Well, right, but a large part of those who oppose the government. I mean, there are the Alawites and there are the Christians, and I mean, what I'm getting at is that this is basically what the parts of Aleppo that are being bombed are determined by, in a certain sense, by their ethnic composition, right? I mean, there is a correlation.
There is a correlation. The Armenian neighborhood, for example, in the old city is still regime controlled. Most of the majority Christian neighborhoods are regime controlled. But there are also a lot of Sunni majority neighborhoods in Aleppo which are still in regime hands. So there's not a one-to-one correlation there. It's, you know, Syria was and is very complicated, and it's getting more complicated every day.
And Aleppo, I guess, could be loosely compared to New York, right? In the sense that it's kind of more the business city, whereas Damascus is the capital, kind of like, you know, New York versus Washington. Is that right?
Yeah, Aleppo it's the biggest city in Syria. It has been the hub for business and trade since, well, millennia, basically. And the interesting thing about Aleppo is, of course, that it joined the revolution only at a very late stage. Until, let's say, last year, June, not a lot was going on in Aleppo. The students at university were staging some demonstrations from time to time. They got beaten up, they were thrown in jail, which is sort of, you know, well, that's Syrian routine, let's call it. But it's only in July last year, so 2012, that suddenly there was this attack by rebel forces from outside and from inside Aleppo, and that the biggest city in the country actually joined the revolution. Now it's turned into a sort of a Stalingrad ever since. You have city warfare, which is very nasty and very unpredictable. Because it can hit you from all sides. There are mortar grenades flying over, there's artillery bombing you, there are the planes in the air. When you get closer to front lines, there are snipers everywhere. So it's it doesn't look pretty.
And is it the case that I mean, you may not have access to this information, but is your sense that the remaining unliberated Sunni neighborhoods, in fact, have an allegiance with the rebellion, whereas the Christian neighborhoods that remain in government hands may not?
It's very hard to say, also because the people over there won't tell you, you know. I personally do know a couple of opposition activists who still live in the regime-held neighborhoods. The university is still regime controlled, although the regime some time ago bombed it. Nobody knows exactly why. They try to deny that they were bombing it. But universities are almost by definition sort of a place where the opposition thrives. So it's very hard to say. Also, the whole sectarian aspect about which you're talking, it's, you know, I know Christians who are on the side of the opposition, I know Christians who are on the side of the regime, I know Christians who are against both because they don't see anything good coming out of this, no matter what. And the same with Armenians. I know Armenians, obviously also Christians, but Orthodox Christians. There are Armenians on the side of the revolution and on the side of the regime. I know Alawites on the side of the revolution as well. So all in all, it is, you know, there is obviously that sectarian divide, which is actually growing. There's no way of denying that. But Syria also has this, you know, there are links between people, communities have been formed throughout centuries, and there are personal loyalties. I know opposition activists who actually get a phone call from Christian people on the side of the regime whose brother has gone missing while serving in the regime army, and whether they could check out where if the brother was somewhere in a hospital or whether he was dead. And they do that because of you know why? Because they study together at the same university. So there are these links, and it's very hard to You know, you can't do any proper research at the moment in Syria. You can't do a proper survey in which you hand people a questionnaire and ask them, like, yeah, well, which side are you on? So, what exactly, how bad is the sectarian situation? It's difficult to say, but it's fair to say that, well, it didn't get any better in the past couple of months, that's for sure.
Okay. Now, do you have any sense for whether a certain fear that's been expressed from the beginning is being realized, which is that the longer this goes on, the more kind of jihadist the rebellion grows in character?
Well, of course, nobody knows how long this is still going to last. I would think still a couple of months. My wife says 2 years or 1 year, depending on which evening we're discussing it. So at the moment, it's clearly more jihadist than it was 6 months ago. When I was in Aleppo 5-6 months ago, let's say the regular FSA brigades, they still talked about these jihadists, mainly the so-called Nusra Front, which is sort of an al-Qaeda affiliated group which actually didn't exist before, which was created during the Syrian revolution. They sort of, dismissed them a bit as, you know, there's a couple of hundreds maximum, a few thousands of them, and they're good fighters, but we'll deal with them after the revolution. Now the situation has obviously changed for all kinds of reasons. Nusra is now more popular than ever. They did a couple of, they scored a couple of military victories. The last thing we heard was that they took over the city of Raqqa, which is more to the east of in Syria. It's not really clear what exactly is going on there. It's also very difficult for journalists to get there. But Nusra at the moment seems to be almost at the forefront of the events on the battlefield. And when I spoke with regular FSA commanders on the ground now, they were getting worried because the Nusra guys are the ones who are doing the hard fighting because, you know, in their ideology, if they die on the battlefield, they go to paradise, so they win. If they don't die on the battlefield, then anyway, there's another day to die there. So, and secondly, because Nusra gets funding and gets arms from abroad. Unlike
where exactly is it? Do you know where it's getting its funding from?
That's very murky because, you know, did we ever find out where al-Qaeda and where Osama bin Laden got his funding from? There was talk about certain Islamist mosque-related organizations, certain business people who shared the ideology. Obviously, in the past couple of months, there has been an influx of arms paid for by Qatar and Saudi Arabia into Syria. But it's still not clear to me where these arms actually ended up, whether they went to, let's say, rather moderate Islamist brigades, Muslim Brotherhood connected, or whether the Nusra Front was one of the beneficiaries.
Yeah. I doubt whether, personally, don't you doubt that Nusra would have been the intended beneficiary? I don't think the Saudi Arabian government wants to empower jihadists. I mean, after all, the average actual jihadist would want to depose the Saudi Arabian government. It's certainly been reported that Saudi Arabia is trying to steer its arms toward the more moderate factions, right?
That sounds logical. If the same goes for the Qatari government, nobody knows. I personally have the same feeling as you do, that it would sound illogical that they would create another Afghanistan much closer to their borders, actually. The main ideology of al-Qaeda in general is not to bomb places in the United States, but it's to take over Saudi Arabia, where the two holy cities are situated. So it sounds illogical, but the problem on the battlefield is indeed that the regular FSA brigades and the Nusra Front and other, well, like-minded jihadi brigades, well, they're fighting together. And there are already a couple of commanders on the ground on record who are saying that, yeah, of course we're sharing whatever it is we're getting because we're fighting the same battle, so we would be stupid not to share this. It's very difficult to get more information about that even when you're on the ground, especially people of the Nusra Front. They're very difficult to approach, and they're also very hierarchical, so you need to speak to a commander, and then the commander is well trained enough to not give you too much information. What is clear is that some more high-tech stuff than there was before is coming in. We've seen YouTube videos of Nusra people shooting down regime helicopters with heat-seeking missiles. Analysis shows
are these shoulder fired, or are these actually fired? Or are these actually larger than that?
No, they're shoulder fired. And the interesting thing about there is that they're actually Chinese made. They're called FN6. They seem to be pretty efficient because if you look at the videos, you see the missile seeking the helicopter and hitting it. Which makes, if more of these things would be coming into Syria, it would make a difference for the revolution, especially for the fighting on the battlefield, because, well, supremacy in the air is exactly what the rebels lack.
Right.
They're still being pounded from the air by jets and by helicopters. They switched their tactics to, well, if we can't take out the planes or the helicopters, then we need to take over the air bases, and that is what they're doing. They're besieging quite a few air bases at the moment. But yeah, and suddenly you see this quite sophisticated Chinese-made missile that takes down Syrian regime helicopters, which is of course quite ironic because the Chinese are supporting the Syrian regime in the UN Security Council together with the Russians.
Yeah, well, the international black market in arms is a very fluid thing, I think.
Exactly.
Now, there were a few weeks ago, I think there were reports that Saudi Arabia had gotten a bunch of weapons from Croatia that it was giving to the rebels. I think, in theory, to the moderate rebels. Now, that included shoulder-fired anti-tank missiles. It was reported. I don't think they mentioned shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles, but there's also now talk by both Britain and France that they want to start arming the rebels and want to put an end to the European Union's arms embargo, either end it or circumvent it. So and the U.S. is sounding more open to providing various kinds of things. I mean, my sense is that there is going to be an increase in the quantity and quality of arms getting to the rebels, and I guess a big question will be which rebels they get to, and whether these powers, all of which would rather keep them in moderate rebel hands, whether these powers can succeed in keeping them there.
Well, the thing is, there is already an increase in arms coming in to the rebel side. That is clear from the type of arms we see now in these YouTube videos, shot by the rebels themselves. You mentioned Croatia. Nobody exactly knows what was on these planes, but you see, types of grenade launchers, anti-tank missiles, shoulder-fired, that are more sophisticated than these, 1940s RPGs from the Soviet Union that the rebels had so far. It's interesting that Britain and France now indeed seems bent to, contribute to deliver arms to what they call the right people, the people who support democracy in a future Syria. First of all, I think they're afraid that, yes, it will turn out that Syria will turn into an all-jihadist show, and that these more moderate brigades, regular brigades, in the end would, not only lose the war against the regime, but also against the jihadists. So they want to support the right people. Is that, well, is that a thing which can be done on the ground when things are so messed up on the ground? It's a very fair question to ask. The French president said today that actually they had guarantees from the military structure of the FSA that, well, the arms would go to the right people in the right place. That obviously means that France is not just going to dump a cargo of arms somewhere across the Syrian border, so there must be some sort of structure that they're trying to set up where French intelligence or French special forces, or I don't know what, will actually be there to keep an eye on certain arms. To be honest, neither the French nor the British have said so far what it is exactly that they would want to provide to the rebels. So is that maybe it's more of the same than what the Saudis are already donating to certain groups? It's, there's a bit of a sort of a political panic phase at the moment because the jihadists seem so successful, first of all, but secondly also because, 1 week there seems to be rebel success on the battlefield, but then for 6 weeks basically nothing moves. And obviously Iran and Russia are giving the regime more funding, more arms. So the regime is still holding out, especially in the whole center of Syria, actually. Well, what is called the center, it's not the geographical center. But from Damascus all the way up to Homs, to Hama, and then to the coast in Tartus and Latakia, things are, there is fighting, but nothing on the scale that we see in Aleppo or in the east. So there is, first of all, that fear of the jihadists, and secondly, there's also the fear that if the West, which basically has not been doing a lot, neither militarily nor when it comes to humanitarian aid so far, that if the West does not do anything, then the regime might still prevail for maybe a couple of years. 1,000 people are dying every week in Syria, 150 per day. That's a lot. All the neighboring countries are flooded with Syrian refugees. More than 1 million, the UN says now, but it could double in a couple of months. Here in Lebanon now, one in every 10 people who's walking around in the streets here is Syrian. So the pressure is becoming very high.
And is there, it's kind of a related question, do you think there's a serious threat of this becoming a regional sectarian war, a Sunni versus Shia war, where, on one side, I guess you'd have Iran, the Syrian regime, the Iraqi regime, the Lebanese, maybe the Lebanese government, but certainly not all of the Lebanese people. And then on the other side, you'd have Sunni states. What is that a much discussed concern?
It's not really being discussed a lot, probably because it's the worst nightmare that people over here can think of. When we spoke a couple of months ago, I told you that I was quite optimistic that in Lebanon things would remain more or less stable for Lebanese standards, because there wasn't at the time a real incentive, for example, for Hezbollah, for the major Shiite faction here, heavily armed, to get really, well, to also destabilize Lebanon because of its ally, the Syrian regime, being under siege. But I also told you at the time that it was getting harder to remain optimistic. And that's where we are now. It's even getting, well, much more harder now to remain optimistic. Hezbollah is obviously investing, well, people, so soldiers and arms into fighting the Syrian uprising at the moment, especially, you know, in the areas just across the border with Lebanon. Iran seems very much determined to keep the Syrian regime alive, whether that is realistic or not. I would say not, but at least they're trying. And nobody else is actually, so far, nobody else, not the Turks, not the Saudis, not the Jordanians, nor the Israelis, have any appetite for a larger war. Everybody actually so far tried to contain Syria to Syria. The big question is what is going to happen if the situation for the Syrian regime is becoming even more dire, if they really seem on the verge of falling. So the two main players who will decide whether this will become a regional war or not are Iran and Hezbollah. And so in the end, they have to make their own calculations whether they can gain anything from widening this war, or whether their position is actually enough safe if they let the Syrian regime and President Bashar al-Assad, whether they just drop him, whether they let him fall. It's very tricky at the moment, and
do you have a sense for, between Iran and Hezbollah, which one fears the demise of the Assad regime more?
I would actually say Iran. If you look at the map, it's obviously Hezbollah which becomes more geographically isolated when they lose Syria. Syria is a neighboring country. There's, well, so to speak, there's a highway, a Shiite highway from Beirut all the way to Tehran. If you look at the map now, you have Lebanon with Hezbollah, Syria, which is, well, not very Shiite, but which is in that axis. You have Iraq, which is now under a Maliki government, Shiite government, and then you have Iran. So if you cut off that access route from Lebanon, from Hezbollah to, well, straight to Iran, let's say, you might think that, yeah, that would be a major strategical loss for Hezbollah. I'm still not sure whether they see it like that. And, well, for sure they're not going to tell me or any other journalist at the moment, so we can't know that for sure. Syria was always a good logistical hub for Hezbollah. They could use Damascus airport. They were smuggling across the borders, which in Lebanon is not very heavily protected in the first place. So they would lose, you know, a logistical hub which comes in handy. But on the other hand, their main backer is clearly Iran, both ideologically, religiously, they're both Shiite, which is not necessarily true for the Syrian regime. And funding-wise, arming, most of it comes from Iran. Secondly, Hezbollah is already so strong militarily. Estimates are that they have already some 20,000 missiles right now somewhere in Lebanon, which they're ready to fire at whomever is attacking them, probably Israel, as was the case in the past. So do they really need that Syrian logistical hub if they know that by inciting a new civil war or a new Israeli offensive, if they can lose all of that, it's a very complicated politics, strategic thinking, and basically we don't know what's going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, and I would imagine that Iran feels pretty generally besieged because of all the international pressure being arrayed against it, and might, for that reason, have a pretty visceral fear of losing an ally, and so may fear the loss of Syria more than Hezbollah. I don't know. And then there's the other factor you mentioned, which is that Hezbollah may have more to lose from getting involved in the war because of what it would do to Lebanon internally. I have just one final question. You know, when we read in American newspapers about these rebel factions that have names like, grandson of the prophet or shield of Muhammad, names like that, I don't know if those are exactly accurate. Those are not necessarily jihadist groups, is that right? I mean, are some of those just kind of, indigenous Syrian groups that, might be Islamist in some sense, but in any event are not kind of natural al-Qaeda affiliates, or are they, in fact, kind of jihadist in character? Do you know?
Well, no. It is complicated, of course, because also there's a huge. People are getting very confused when it comes to definitions of what is what. Islam is a religion. Islamism is a political ideology based on that religion. Salafism is an even extremer version based on the same, but all of that still not necessarily includes an international jihad as we know it from al-Qaeda in the past. So it might mean that you just want a very conservative society where, a sheikh and Islamic preachers, let's say, have much more of a say than they do in certain countries now. When it comes to jihadists, they're not all, I would even say, the large majority of them is not foreign. They're Syrians. There were Syrians fighting against the USA, against the American troops in Iraq before. It's a neighboring country, and there were people ideologically attached to then al-Qaeda in Iraq. It's very interesting and both very complicated that what you see now is that quite a few Syrians I talked to in Aleppo and Aleppo province, they actually don't like the Nusra front that much anymore because they find it too much of a foreign operation. They don't like foreign intervention, and that includes Kuwaitis or Tunisians or, I'm from Belgium this week, our state security, our intelligence services said that 70 Belgians of Moroccan origin are actually fighting in Syria. They don't speak the language, they don't know the culture. So Syrians are becoming a bit wary of, we don't like the Americans invading us, but we also don't like Kuwaitis telling us what to do, or let alone Afghans or Uzbeks or Chechens. So there are now also jihadist groups which only accept Syrian fighters. Are they then, you would say that from a Western perspective, that's at least progress, because these are not the guys who are going to move to London next week and blow up the metro there. But it is all becoming very murky. Or there are also, regular FSA brigades who are, to be honest, extremely conservative Islamic. There are very few brigades that call themselves secular at the moment. So Because of how complicated the definitions are, and then, yeah, you have all these names referring to Islamic history mainly, or, well, names that basically don't mean a lot, like the free people of the Levant, or the free people of Syria, or, you know, everybody can call themselves the free people, especially in a revolution. So mapping all these brigades and what their affiliation really is very difficult. The one thing that I'm a bit astonished about is that our intelligence services, although I'm not a member of them, but I mean European, Turkish, American intelligence services had 2 years to do all that mapping. So they should have a better overview of who is exactly what and who could be trusted more than others and who fits more into our pattern of thinking. And I find it a bit worrisome that sometimes you get the impression now that they're sort of almost starting that job now, which is quite late. So when the French president today said that he has guarantees that he will deliver arms to the right people, I hope, well, his guys have done a proper job in finding out who these people are, who he's going to give the weapons to.
Okay. Well, listen, thank you so much for taking the time. I mean, this is, for the most part, not very encouraging news, but it's good to have. Do you know when do you plan to go back to Syria again?
If I would know, I would not tell you, Bob.
Okay. I can understand that. Okay, well, thanks so much, Jorn, for taking the time. I hope we'll talk again.
Thank you, Bob.
Bye-bye.
Bye.